This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
So this is Paul Verschure with the Convergent Science Network podcast. Here we're at BCBT 2018 together with my colleague Tony Prescott. Hi, Tony.
Hello.
Good to see you. And we're here with Lluís Fuentemilla, who is a great researcher of memory. Right? So what's your definition of memory?
I think memory, because it's kind of a complex question. But definitely the way I would perceive memory is one of the only functions that allows us to bring some persistence over time. So basically it links moment to moment into a continuity. That's the way I see it these days.
Okay, but now the title of your talk was To Shape the Unfolding Experience into a Memory Code.
So the idea of the title was a bit to kind of like point out that at the end of the world, or at the end of the day, the way we create a world is based on the way we make representations of our inputs, and that transformation, which is like in essence one of the biggest problems nowadays to face, somehow should be shaped by a representational system and some mechanisms that should be frame into the memory function, let's say. So if you put this kind of argument into the extreme, well, I would say that somehow, right, the way you perceive or the way you see the world or interact with the world, it should be definitely shaped by a memory system. So it's kind of like a loop thing.
Right. So now, to start your talk, you also emphasize, remember, this whole issue that also a memory system is also actually about forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's about selectivity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how do you see the selectivity of a memory system? What defines its selectivity?
Well, I think this is one of the important puzzles that we are facing in the memory, because assuming that you're forgetting, it's quite logic, because we experience that, I think, and everybody would accept this. But on the other hand, we fail into this fallacy of accepting that something doesn't exist because we cannot observe it. So at the end, like from a experimental point of view, it makes sense to assume that anytime you cannot recall things, it's because they are forgotten, and that might have a function. But on the other hand, there's this sort of like a fallacy of assuming that this doesn't exist. And I think the more you so I'm not going to the response directly to what you answer, to what your question was. But I think this is one of the fundamental problems these days. Like, what do we really forget? And if we forget anything, because at the end you can assume that at the end you create mental schemas, or you kind of like transform into mental configurations that might also impact into the future. So that's on the one hand, the problem of forgetting. But on the other hand, I think that from like a kind of like a mechanistic point of view, it makes total sense that somehow most of our information should kind of like disappear from our to be kind of like directly available. And then forgetting should be useful for this. So it has to be some sort of like a pruning process, at least from the availability point of view.
And it kind of raises the question, what is memory for? I mean, why do we have memory?
Mm-hmm.
What is the practical use for an animal to have memory or for a human?
Well, I guess maybe the way I see it now, at least with the research I'm currently doing, is because it helps you learning more. It helps you interact like effectively. And I wouldn't say take decisions, because that enters into the decision-making world. And I'm not like spotting into this, but somehow the idea that memory basically shapes your experience is because you assume that should be useful in the future for something.
Yeah.
So you make right. It's kind of like, I guess it's like in the middle of like this predictive coding scheme as well somehow.
I mean, I think there's a sort of contrast with our everyday idea of what memory is for, which is for retrieving things that have happened in the past and reliving them and so on. Whereas, in fact, maybe why the systems have evolved as they are is to help us in the here and now to make better choices.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess that's kind of like an important question. So the extent to which memory just can be simplified, if you wish, or kind of like a big kind of like a chunked into a kind of a functions to take decisions or not, or whether this brings you out something else into higher level functions like the self or like this sort of like a perseverance of your identity, if you wish. I think it's a mystery. As a psychologist, I am not that into the idea of like assuming that memory is just simple function, or it can be simplified as a function to take decisions for the future. I would like to think that there's something, it brings up something else as well, like the self, for instance, which I'm not that sure. Maybe we can discuss this possibility, to what extent the self or the agency can be also like simplified, or it exists because it helps us out to take decisions for the future, or optimal decisions.
And how about mental time travel?
Well, I mean, that's kind of like the Endel Turing suggestion from the very beginning, isn't it? Like the essence of like episodic memory and what basically distinguishes us from animals. I sympathize with the idea that we can basically, that memory kind of like, it's the only way that we can just loop around time in a virtual world, which is extremely relevant for many of our interactions with I guess that the crucial point is whether we need to be conscious about this constantly, the autonoetic function of memory, or let's say property. In my view, actually, I think that actually this mental time travel like property is essential, and I fully believe that it's like a critical point for at least in humans. Yeah.
Right. So in your own research that you discussed, the starting point were these models of memory that had a dual process perspective, right? Where you would say, look, we have acquisition of memory, two phases, and there's retention and expression memory. Acquisition is the more hippocampal process, and the long-term retention and also expression is a more cortical process. Right? So why are these dual process models relevant as a starting point for your research?
So basically, this kind of like dual system model, it's like an ancient thing, and it's a kind of traditional view from the 90s, and still think it persists heavily. And I would say that that's something that people like is taking it more and more serious, or basically because they're proving, or it seems to be a valuable point of view to address many of the problems that are needed to understand to understand how the memory is supported by the brain. So I like the idea of this dualism because memory should be a function that should deal with present. You cannot just think about I don't really like the idea of thinking about memory as an encoding process and a retrieval process, as if these two were completely separate. Because it's completely pointless in daily life activity. We're not just, basically canceling out everything from the surrounding and just retrieving properly, or just incorporating information, at least when we are grown, because, right, the memory is always there and representations are there. So at the moment that you try to simulate this reality, then you need a system that deals with this. And this dualism seems to be, at least from the principle, or the kind of like the essence of the mechanism, seems to be quite strict to understand it. That's why I feel comfortable with that. And I think that's why people now that basically are trying to bring this conceptualization of memory as something that might deal with the present is comfortable with as well. So the moment you bring computational models, you start talking about states, how states are basically relevant for decision making, right? All these sort of questions that people are bringing up now. I think these models, that's why these models are so influential again and again.
But now the experimental paradigm that you pursued focuses very much on this notion of reactivation. Right. So in some sense, we had a simplified model so far in our minds, which is we have acquisition, retention, expression. But now you bring in an additional component in that process, which is reactivation. Right. So why do you think reactivation gives you a lever in understanding how memory functions?
I think reactivation is based, on the frame of this event these days. I'd say that it's a direct parallel of this sort of metaphor of, let's say, of a living machine. So it's one of the instances from a memory point of view, and from this idea that there's these two systems that basically interact heavily at the moment. There's, on the one hand, there should be an interaction, and this interaction should be based on a transformation of the inputs. Should be kind of right? I mean, it should be something. It should be the two of them should talk into a language that should be memory based, let's say. And reactivation helps us, or helped me at least, to basically formulate a mechanistic hypothesis that fit quite well with this possibility. It's one of these mechanisms that really allowed me to think about how we instantly rapidly transform any experience into a kind of like, let's say, a memory buffer, very initially, like working memory if you wish, but also at long term, right, after sleep consolidation. That's why I kind of like to frame this mechanism as a kind of like critical ingredient for initial transformation of not just perceptual system itself, but for what we call, let's say, experience memory transformation, if you wish, something slightly more complex. And this replay can incorporate anything. I mean, at the moment that you create a parallel world, even if it's instantly rapid and interacts with the rest of the brain, let's say, then at that point you can incorporate as many things as you wish, like goals, right, value, whatever you wish in there. And I think it's relevant because it's quite effective.
I mean, would you say that replay was the mechanism for consolidation, or are there other ways?
Well, I guess it's not the only one. I wouldn't believe that that's the only one. It's one that fits well with the systems level consolidation model. But for instance, there's another one which is quite intriguing in my view from Giulio Tononi, like the the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis, which basically states that the brain has this sort of like a threshold state that basically is lowered during the night, during REM sleep, especially. That's what they claim. And at that time, anything that has not like the strength in connection that basically surpass this threshold dies, and forgetting is based on that. So at the end, I think it's a combination of many mechanisms, but replay seems to be critical, at least, like to fit into this sort of like holistic model of how this the hippocampus with the brain interacts.
I mean, I think in sort of associative models of memory, you need something like replay because one-shot learning is not practical in most of those models. Neural network models, for example, don't learn well off one example. They have to repeat the example, and they generally have to interleave it with lots of other examples to maintain balance. So, and this brings you to this opinion that you said that you have to have this fast learning, one-shot learning system, and then that trains the slow learning systems. So you see a big difference there between the way that the fast learning system will operate and how consolidation is happening elsewhere in the brain.
Exactly. It's like simulating the rehearsal phenomena. So the idea that right, you train the other system to acquire this knowledge. Still we assume that replay is a kind of like direct correspondence with input somehow. And that's something that I'm not that sure yet. For instance, like we use this sort of like methodology with the classification approach, right? With the pattern classifiers, multivariate decoding algorithms, which is basically essentially you assume, right, that input or the elements or basically neural responses, neural patterns elicited during experience should be similar to those that are that should be similar to those that basically are linked to the replay activity or to the. And that comes because we know the animal model with the phase precession, the sequence. But the animal studies are slightly limited compared to human experience. And I think we are really like far away still to kind of like make this kind of like bridge this gap, right? We take this assumption that sequenced pattern completion, all these sort of like elements that involve replay that has been shown in animals should correspond to our human experience, or let's say our learning experience. And I'm not that sure yet about that. I'm not sure if anybody knows it yet. But we take this for granted, but I'm not sure. I guess that for the kind of like the living machines, these sort of like questions are quite relevant, isn't it? Because for some of the projects you guys are like working on these days.
Well, I think this
is the right point. Are we talking about
absolutely
interaction, unidirection.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I think the process of consolidation can be thought of as multi-stage because your consolidation, you're still consolidating an episodic memory. But at some point where there are commonalities across episodic memories, you consolidate further into declarative memory and you lose the sort of maybe, or it's less important to have those memories specifically tagged to particular events that had happened. So you learn something that's common across events. So, I mean, is that distinction useful to you, or do you think everything you're studying is episodic?
No, absolutely not. Actually, that's one of the puzzles. For instance, like we're running one of the experiment with, let's say in a real world, which we ask people to kind of like these, we use these wearable devices, and we ask people to wear this camera for a long time, because one of the puzzles is that when you bring people and you test, let's say, episodic, you ask them to recall episodic sequences of their own life. Most of the things are basically forgotten. They are, if you are into a routine day life, you go to the office, right? You go home. Things are so highly overlapping that you may say that most of your episodic memories are forgotten. So at the end of the day, especially with, so at the end of the day, when you test for the classic episodic memory recollection, let's say, this vividness completely disappears. People is messing up. And we think that actually...
Or they're using a schema to sort of fill out.
Then we need some... I think that actually, in the system, the way we replay information, the way we consolidate it, we need to put some more weight into this sort of like mental models that are slightly more relevant. Of course, episodic memory, I think it's, in essence, it's extremely important and defines our many aspects, and it has a direct link with animals. But still, in our day life, it might not have the impact that we may... I'm not sure about this argument, but it's a fact, right? I mean, we've been doing that. We ask people to wear these cameras. We do have like instances. We can even like record like short clips. We bring them back to home, to the lab. We ask for the memories, and they realize that it's their own life, but they cannot recollect the full experience. They cannot recollect the event. It's like, come on, guys, it's your own life. I mean, isn't it supposed to be?
Well, it's another skill, isn't it, to actually to be able to convert memories into narrative. And I think and the developmental literature shows that children prior to school age are terrible at sort of telling stories about their lives, but they learn that, and as adults we get better at it. Some people are better at it.
Well, maybe that also illustrates your earlier point about memories also forgetting. Right?
Exactly.
That's our story.
Exactly.
But you guys, for me, are moving really quick, because you have an experimental paradigm where you test memory using reactivation, and you do it using a conditioning paradigm, which actually is, again, bringing another, also a possible confound in there we should look at, right? Because basically what you do is you have pairs of stimuli or sets of stimuli, one of which you condition your subject to with a sound, right? And then you use the sound during sleep to, as you believe, reactivate that memory, and hopefully through that trigger the whatever chain of items or memories it is related to, right? This is the core paradigm. And what you see with your healthy subjects is that you get about a 10% improvement in recollection of associated items, right? From that stimulus that you trigger with the sound, as compared to stimuli you don't reactivate. So now we know, so we could say, well, so you've shown that reactivation during sleep leads to a slightly improved recollection, 10%. More.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, imagine how it would be like to have more than 10%, right? We would have like the key of a...
look.
Yeah, it's quite subtle there. So.
Then, okay, so here you go. So, but now, during sleep, does it matter when you play the sound, how long and what intensity, how often?
Yeah.
What's the trick there?
So that's a really important aspect actually of the design that I haven't mentioned in the presentation.
I realized that.
I have to admit, I was just halfway through of my slide. I know what happened. No, seriously. I mean, I really wanted to present the last time. I don't know. I'm not that bad in time. I mean, it's kind of like time scaling thing.
Somebody was interrupting.
No, it was really funny. It was funny, absolutely.
Really?
But no, right. So we are not sure about this kind of like the kind of like intensity of the sounds. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any kind of like study saying that that the intensity has to be in a certain level so that like the trigger things during sleep. That's we definitely have to repeat the presentation more than once. Repeat a few times to at least we repeated like 7 times each of the sounds per condition or per association. But we know from others that sometimes they have to repeat it even more. So that's an important aspect. You're right. But the critical point, and something we control because we know it from many studies, is that at least it seems that to induce some sort of like beneficial effects of this sort of like artificial reactivation, let's say, design, these sort of memories have to be specifically reactivated during slow wave sleep, which is like one of the deep sleep, what they call. It's one of these stages, like it's basically stage 3 and 4. So it's basically taking place normally in the first half of the sleep. So sleep has this small architecture, kind of like with 5 stages, but there's two big stage of like a sleep stages that are basically defined by brain activity. REM sleep, slow wave sleep, and slow wave sleep is the critical one because they claim is where there are few neurophysiological signals and responses and mechanisms that seems to be specially dedicated to promote this sort of interaction between hippocampus and cortical regions.
Mm-hmm. Is that counterintuitive? Wouldn't you have expected that playing it during REM sleep would work better?
Well, the point is that during REM sleep, it is believed that the cortical activity is highly active and is completely uncoupled to hippocampus. So then the model wouldn't work in that way, because the model assumes that this dual model system level learning thing basically assumes that memories are somehow like initially stored in the hippocampus, probably together with our neocortex, and during this sort of like consolidation window, this optimal state, these two regions, or these two kind of like networks, let's say, interact heavily, and that needs to be in a moment in which they do it. And probably also it's known that this is a moment where you are fully disconnected from the environment, which is basically you might focus a bit more to kind of like tie up a bit, like the mess you have in your brain, if you wish. So it's, you say because the REM sleep involves like a higher, let's say, more cortical.
So that would already point to the fact that that's really like a system. Memory, in this case, is a system property that exists in interaction with hippocampus and cortex.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes, exactly. Well, that's the idea of the model. And that, there are many papers showing that makes sense in animal studies with entorhinal cortex and with recently with auditory areas using similar sort of like designs. And in humans with fMRI, there are a few papers as well. Also with kids, they was just recently published.
Right.
So some of the data you're pointing to were showing replay in hippocampus and replay subsequently in cortex. There was that in the sort of sensory cortical area. It was visual cortex, was it? But you interpret the replay in cortex as being about memory consolidation as well as the replay in hippocampus, because the replay in cortex could just be the playing out of the memory. So the consolidation could happen in one or both places,
yes,
or in some other place where you're not measuring.
No, you're right. That's, this model, the model that basically these two systems are fully separated, and then basically start interacting in specific moments with your consolidation function, and then completely uncouple again. I think it's a bit extremistic, if you wish. It's not totally valid in the context of interaction with the world. One of the things we know is that whenever you recall information, at least from fMRI studies and some animal studies as well, whenever you recall vividly an information, somehow sensory related areas, maybe not like the primary areas, but sensory related areas linked to these memories tend to be active. In essence, it would be the full idea is that this kind of vividness of your memories should be supported by some sort of representative formats, or maybe. So in that sense, assuming that replay involves representational stages of this information to help out transforming it, it's not incongruent or not.
When we're thinking about what's been consolidated, presumably we're imagining a very different signal in the hippocampus from the one that's in cortex. The hippocampal one is going to be a very much compressed version of the memory, and then it's going to be reconstructed in particularly the sensory cortex, is going to be reconstructing something like the original stimulus or the effect that stimulus would have in cortex. So, for consolidation, to be effective, I guess it does have to happen in multiple areas of the brain, or it does have to be the case that this system can reliably reconstruct based on a compressed trace. So, do you think of it in those terms?
I think it's a really wonderful idea. Kind of like there's somebody mentioning that in this kind of like event, this idea that like a memory or memory representation, or let's say like a virtual representation of the world, it's timeless, right? And we give some sort of like a structure, we give some sort of like a real sense of like a reality whenever you bring it to a similar sensory input. Somebody just mentioned this possibility, and I think kind of like I think it was Josh, maybe something, or maybe it was Josh then. So somehow this sort of like compression phenomena, I think it makes sense in this framework, so that the memory doesn't really care about time itself. For instance, it's just like a compact version, and then maybe at the moment that you interact with the system that is fully dedicated to interact with the world, then you have to give this other code. Is it what you are like?
Well, the thing is, when you think it through, it gets rather complicated, because you have perceptual learning systems which are encoding signals, sending them to the hippocampus, which is storing them in some way, and then that's being retrieved and replayed and has to be decoded. That decoding, so that encoding is being learned and can change over time. So anything you've stored in the hippocampus could become outdated and may no longer match the decoding apparatus. So everything has to be kept in balance. And so all this sort of, in computer terms, offline learning that's going on during sleep may be about rebalancing all these different systems so that they're all in sync.
Yeah.
Well, that's also what Lluís, what your second experiment you discussed also speaks to that, right? Because there you looked at the competition between memories, where you had two kinds of associations, A and B and C, right? And you looked at how then triggering B would affect the reactivation-dependent recollection of A and C. But then what you looked at also is sort of the time delay in that process, right? Like if you saw A, B 3 hours ago, right? And now I'm going to do a reactivation experiment. Does this time delay influence the memory? So is there a competition between memories, right? So I hope I summarized the experiment correctly. Because the point there was that you did see a competition between memories, as you call it, right? That's correct.
Correct.
But do you see this as an active competition or passive? That means, let's say, since I saw something a while back, there might be a decay of a trace, a non-specific decay. It's not regulated by anything. Alternatively, it might be an actively regulated competitive process, right? That really compares the activity levels and winner takes all, whatever. Okay. So how do you see this competitive process play out given the data that you have?
No, I think it's a really important point, and that we couldn't disentangle. But we did observe something quite relevant that might speak about the possibility that there's something active. Although it's a bit like contradicts a bit that the active phenomenon, active process could happen while you sleep, right? So in one of the points of the experiment, it was just a very fast slide at the very end. So we also studied how are the neural signals or neural oscillatory activity elicited by the sounds of the two conditions while people were sleeping. So people was completely like unaware of the environment. They were we could control for this, like slow wave sleep were on track. And then we studied which were the neural responses when you gave the sound, when you presented the sound, on the condition in which associated memories were boosted afterwards, and on the condition in which associated memories were forgotten, or kind of like forgetting was promoted. So it was exactly the same circumstance, exactly the same one. People were basically sleeping, the same sort of sounds because counterbalanced, but the neural signals were completely different. So it seemed that actually the brain treated this input right completely different as a function of what it has to be done. That was the interpretation we did because we had the behavioral effect. And that, of course, we could not like attribute that as if it was an active or a passive. But it seems to me that somehow the brain entailed the memory reactivation phenomena, but when it detected that it competed somehow with because of we just hypothesized that it was because of this the strength of this association was not, could be potentially complicated to deal with in the future, then this activates also this other mechanism, this extra mechanism that we couldn't see in one condition. So like to kind of like summarize this point, we observed that under the same conditions, experimental conditions, with the same sort of like stimuli, and during sleep, in one of the neural responses were slightly different. And one component just appeared in one of the conditions, not the other one. So I think it seems to me that actually these organizational principles are active, I'd say.
And you would place them in hippocampus and cortex or in their interaction? And what's the mechanism behind that? How do you envision that?
Well, well, I guess from psychology point of view, the easiest way to see this is under the framework of like this sort of like induced forgetting phenomena, for instance. So the idea that so there are these studies from Michael Anderson and others who basically state that whenever you inhibit yourself to retrieve information, right, actively, right, you stop your thinking about this. The consequence of this at the long term is that suddenly or eventually you might not recall this information anymore. This is like an effect that has been like framed into specific experimental design, and we know it depends on this. But somehow the possibility that this may happen also speaks about this idea that this active forgetting may take place in the brain. And it helped us out understand this phenomenon, at least in the context of this study.
Right.
Of course, I mean, I guess that making the parallel of our experiment where people were sleeping with induced forgetting, where people is trying effort, I mean, putting an effort to forget this is just not completely different story. Yeah? But still, maybe the mechanism is similar.
But that then also links to this idea you discussed through your third experiment on how to avoid memory clutter, right? To avoid memory clutter would actually mean that you actively also forget or suppress.
Sure.
Right?
I think actually that the way we understand or the way we see forgetting is extremely essential so the incorporation of forgetting allows you to understand, right, that the memory is organized some way. Otherwise, I mean, thinking about that things are associated, considering that most of our experiences, especially when we are like experts in learning and we acquire so much knowledge, the links that we can make with things are so high. And so at any point that we need some sort of like principles that govern this problem. And forgetting, it's extremely useful, isn't it?
One of the principles that you pointed to was what you called the non-monotonic plasticity hypothesis. And that suggested that the sort of generalization that could happen occurred to similar stimuli, but then there was a dip. So what occurred to me thinking about that was one of the challenges you have in episodic memory is to distinguish memories that are similar in some way, but that you need to keep separate. Sort of what we would call pattern separation in neural networks. And that this non-monotonic plasticity is maybe about that, keeping these memories separate that you need to remember what was different about coming to the lab today compared to coming to the lab yesterday, even though much of the context is the same. So, I mean, is that a useful concept for you, thinking about pattern separation is a key thing here, and where also you might want to have active mechanisms for pushing patterns apart?
Yes, I think this is like this kind of like duality, or the kind of like the pattern separation, pattern completion phenomenon. It's an essential mechanism to make us understand many aspects, like right, how things that happen in the same context can still be kind of like represented separately.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult because, as you say, it's very context dependent.
Yes, absolutely.
So some things you want to see them as the same. For depending on the question, you might want to see it as the same event.
This non-monotonic plasticity hypothesis that you mentioned from Newman and Norman, to me seems to say more about active forgetting, because you're speaking of a threshold of plasticity. If you fall below this threshold, then you get regression, right? You dissolve those connections. So this would not necessarily get you pattern separation, right? It gives you more pattern, if you want, sharpening, removing the low frequency components of it, right? If you sharpen, if you want.
No, the initial idea of this model when they basically proposed it was in line of like to try to explain a bit the phenomenon of like active forgetting in the sense of like their experiments. I think actually the pattern separation and pattern completion phenomena, which is a complex thing, and especially to be tested in humans, is still like many people that might complain about the possibility to quantify this in humans, even though there are wonderful experiments around the world on this topic with humans. But even though this kind of like concern, there's also something that should be incorporated in these models, which is like because the essence here is what is the elements of experience, what is the contextual elements of experience, because the two are basically playing the essential role in pattern separation, pattern completion, the way we conceptualize this.
Yeah.
But the way we understand context many of the times involves like our physical surroundings, right? Or you can even like jump it up to a mental schema if you wish. Like, I don't know how the hierarchy can go up. But there's this sort of like idea that there's this kind of like temporal context as well. Right? This sort of like and in fact, it exists, this model called like temporal context model from Mike Hanna. And I think this temporal context idea is also fundamental and has not been treated, it's been treated like kind of fairly, but has not been, at least to my understanding, has not been like incorporated into pattern completion, pattern separation phenomena. The sense that we can tease apart like phenomena, things that happen, right, in the same context, in different days, right? That's one of the puzzles. But maybe the temporal context might explain quite easily because, the time domain of these experiences are that simple. And the way we code for time, right, which is like another important aspect, might kind of like help us understand it. I mean,
but wait, just for my understanding, earlier you were saying the memory system you study is agnostic about time. It just time warps everything to make it really very compact.
Well, that was one of the ideas that one of the speakers suggested, and I thought that was wonderful. But I already like came up with some of the findings that people are like finding these days. The existence of like time cells, what they call. So basically, like cells in the hippocampus, which basically seem to be coding like temporal gaps between intervals.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of like the idea that time should be represented differently in the brain, and that the memory system kind of like does not rely on the way we understand time. But still, right? It seems that
if you want to do mental time travel, you better do it faster than real time. That doesn't help you very much. Okay, so this whole separation between the time warped and compressed represent the more event and order. In which you then separately again, let's say, inflated time-wise to bring it back to behavioral time. Okay, that would make sense. But I think as a memory system, you want to compress, right? You want to forget, you want to get rid of information. So maybe you don't want to have, like, say, the real-time interval mixed in with the event sequence.
Yeah.
In fact, when you explore autobiographical memory abilities of people in these experiments I've been in, and some, like discussions with other experts or experts on autobiographical memory field, you just realize that the first thing that people forget is this kind of like temporal context information, right? Well, one of the properties of experience that seems to be disappearing quite rapidly compared to others. So like salience, novelty, spatial context seems to be quite, whenever you can recall information, seems to be quite preserved. But the temporal information, which experience was before, when was exactly, was like, I mean, you have the sort of like sense that it was not yesterday, and it was whether it was yesterday or was 1 week ago. But you are, right, you're missing, it seems that it's something that disappears quite rapidly. But that's right. That's not
special. I like that, and I agree with you. But also too, so before we really move to the MEG work that you did on memory, so we started out with a dual process model, right? Which is like an acquisition and retention model, hippocampus, cortex, right? So it's not necessarily saying they work together. It's saying now first hippocampus, then the cortex. So given the experiments we've looked at so far, what should be our conclusion with respect to how cortex and hippocampus work together to realize memory?
Let me try to get the point. So maybe one way to think about these two systems in the context of this event is that the hippocampus is essential, is the very first one to generate a virtual world. And And without that, it would be completely impossible to kind of like. No, that's what I would think actually.
Where's the item information now?
Which item? Sorry.
Well, also in your task, I have items.
Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So when we have an episode, it's actually a number of items tied together, right? Mm-hmm. So you see that as also as a hippocampal process.
I think it's definitely involved, as if it was like trying to resolve a binding problem. Mm-hmm. Whether it's stored there or it requires the neocortex for that.
Okay. So would you say they cortex hippocampus work together?
Yes.
From beginning till the end of the existence of this memory. Yeah. Okay. So this whole idea of sort of the traditional models, like hippocampus acquires, cortex retains, that you don't support now. Given the data you have.
I wouldn't say so, right? I mean,
that's fine. Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say so at all, actually.
Okay.
I think it's a slightly more, the interaction between the two are more relevant that we can think about.
And then you would what would be the relative contributions of the two? Mm-hmm. If you would have to give them a functional label, what would the hippocampus contribute? What does the cortex contribute?
I think actually like the representation itself, like the way we understand, like the kind of like similar to what Tony was mentioning. So the idea that the representation of like something that resembles truly related to the inputs we had must be stored somewhere in your cortex, and the hippocampus should be free to do other sort of like things. Could work, for instance, like as an index, as a pointer, something that allows to to kind of like bind distributed information over we need to recall for anything. We need to give agency. We need to give value. All these sort of things. It also mean the hippocampus might also be an optimal place to do comparisons, rapid comparisons of what you expect priors with current inputs, and that's and basically to get drive signals to update models, for instance. So this sort of like computational issues should be driven by the hippocampus.
Right.
That's what I think. While the representation itself, the way we understand representation in the way, might be better stored distributed in the cortex. That's the way I understand that.
Okay.
So that's why at the end we always see the two of them connected because, right, they always work together.
Okay, so tell me an idea of the system, right? And so now we can complexify, right? Because then you start to look at MEG. Mm-hmm. And then what you observed is that if you just look at the frequency distributions or the power spectra of your MEG data, that better performance in these recall tests was correlated with also much more pronounced and coordinated response in theta, let's say somewhere around 8 hertz or so, as compared to impoverished recall, where you saw a much more distributed distribution across the power spectrum, right, of energy in the different frequencies. So is that a significant observation? Is this informative for us now? If we start to think about this hippocampal cortical system, so now suddenly theta pops out in a very discrete time window, 2 seconds, I think, after Stoney's presentation. So what's that telling us now about this memory system? How is that important?
So I think actually the relevance of this finding is that it basically expresses this, or it puts some evidence in humans, which was the point at that time. It put this evidence in humans by showing that there's some sort of like principle of organization of information. If you understand information representation as if it could be captured by a pattern classifier, which is something that could, right, be endless discussed. But assuming that this is like something that we can argue, it basically provides a mechanistic model that basically confirms the idea that we need some sort of like organization during maintenance. Otherwise, information is basically wouldn't be preserved in a bound manner, if you wish.
Okay, but does that bring you to this notion of non-Lisman, of a theta gamma code for memory?
That was the point from the very beginning. That was the point. So the idea is like conceptually speaking, we didn't advance. So there's no conceptual advancement compared. It was a much more methodological tour de force, let's say, if you wish, because at that time, this model of this sort of like representation or this sort of like mechanism that are tightly related to representations couldn't be tested in humans, at least as far as we knew. And I think the data was quite nice, but completely in line with the model, at least at that time. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think it's relevant because it also like bridges the gap with like mechanistic models that were kind of like shown in animals in many aspects, and it confers some relevance to the idea that this kind of like a phase coding mechanism that seems to be quite that relevant in many memory memory functions.
Right.
So now, for instance, like so that paper came out like 2011, I think. It's a kind of like an old one now these days. And I know from some of the work we did afterwards, because at that time we were one of the first doing these sort of like things. But now more people is working on this. We've discussed that, maybe not like linking it with theta, but somehow it seems that this sort of like a dual approach between like oscillations and this sort of like possibility to search for representation, which is another question, right? So this kind of like tool or this sort of like combination of tools.
Yeah, but so far then, so the universe looks like very consistent, right? So we have an idea about reconsolidation or reactivation, how we can use that for consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
We have an idea how hippocampus and cortex work together. We also see signatures of dynamics that look comfortably close to theta gamma coding. So things look consistent, right? And manageable.
Mm-hmm.
But then you started doing these decoding experiments with your MEG data where you looked at the reoccurrence of frequency patterns in your MEG signal, right? So you were measuring your MEG over many leads. I don't know how many hundreds you had, but plenty.
Mm-hmm.
Then from there, you extracted, if you will, templates of frequency responses.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just use the classifier to say, well, if I'm acquiring the memory, can I see any kind of echoing of that frequency pattern in a memory interval as I'm waiting to perform a recall test, right? This was the experiment you performed. And then what you showed to us was surprisingly complicated, right? And also surprisingly complicated because this is MEG, so you sit at the outside of all, you sit on the skull. So now we measure really like a very average signal across all brain structures, not only hippocampus anymore, right? The whole brain cortex. So on the one hand, it's amazing because you could really recover a pattern. The patterns were replayed in the waiting period, right? Before the recall test was applied. So yes, you saw the dynamic pattern that the brain formed to store the memory is retained in this waiting period. Okay, great. But on the other hand, we would also say, and that pattern is occurring everywhere. It's across the whole of cortex because as far as I understood your data, it was not very restricted to, let's say, the temporal lobes. Or correct me if I'm wrong. So is that not now really some rocking the boat in a rather dramatic way? Like we were doing so well, like everything looks so neatly organized, and now we have this MEG classification result, which seems to throw everything again in disarray. So what do we do with that?
That's actually at that time that was one of the things that we discussed heavily in the group. So we assume that there's some representation. We assume that there should be some coding mechanisms for the representation. But other than that, we don't know anything. Or at least not that we can, like make any strong hypothesis about. One would say, for instance, like, well, because it's an offline representation, that should not involve sensory systems, for instance. But that's not the case. I mean, people have shown that in animals and humans. Right, okay, let's forget about that. So then, let's think that actually this information should be kind of like represented in the higher visual areas, for instance, right? Which it's true, but it might still affect like right? Or there are associative areas or like frontal regions, for instance. So at that time, to be honest, we didn't know how to deal with this, and we still see it complicated. I wouldn't say we didn't resolve this. And actually, we kind of like discussed this with one of the reviewers, and we said like, yeah, I mean, that's the way it is. That's the way we saw it. And we think that it's extremely complex. I mean, at least in that paper, we use like at least more than 50 frequency bands, actually, 50 frequencies. We include more than 50 frequencies.
From delta to gamma, the whole.
No, we didn't include theta, not via our coupling measure. So we include from like, I think it was 14 hertz up to like 80 or something like this. Other like, like the highest ones never kind of like showed. But at the end of the day, unless you use some sort of like clustering algorithm that allows you to kind of like slightly summarize like into MEG in a way, statistical way, you always see so much noise in the data. We didn't implement any sort of like clustering approach because we didn't know what to observe. And at that time, we didn't know how to deal with the decoding algorithm that well. I mean, we just, like jump into using this sort of like deep net thing or hidden layers, which was super complex. That was another problem of the project. Because we used the hidden layer algorithm, we couldn't be fully certain about which were the patterns that were basically accounting for the reactivation. So at the end, we kind of like inferred that because we show some of these patterns in the supplementary material. But we never wanted to make any argument because methodological reasons didn't allow us to do it. And on the other hand, we didn't have any sort of hypothesis. So yeah, I mean, I guess it speaks again about the representational problem, isn't it?
But in your mind, was it the end of Theta Gamma code or?
No. No, because we couldn't ever like talk about sequential patterns.
Okay.
And I think that's a critical aspect to talk about, right?
Yeah, but a device such as the brain, like a neural network, doesn't necessarily need to treat space and time differently. You can convert one into the other, and vice versa. So, that's. And people do. If you're compressing a movie, time's just another dimension along which you're compressing the data alongside space. So you're looking for patterns that are temporal and spatial within the image and temporal across frames. And so you'd think the hippocampus is going to do something similarly clever. It's just going to look for ways of compressing information across all these dimensions. I don't think time is going to be particularly privileged there. And so you could imagine a spatial code for time, which is what the time cells in CA3 may indicate. Or you could imagine, these phase precession patterns. But I think this is something a little bit naive to assume that because there's a temporal sequence coming in, it's got to have a temporal storage.
Well, there's order information you might want to conserve. Right?
Yeah, but you can do that spatially. You can map it into a spatial pattern which has order.
But then all right. So
you read it out then, right? So
well, it has to be in the way it's encoded. There has to be some knowledge about how to read it out. So you have a cell which has a timestamp, but it's or you have depending on where you are in that bit of CA3, you're encoding something about time in the sequence. These things are totally possible. The space encodes time.
Look at the physiology of sweeps and shortwave ripples and phase precession.
Well, there you go. Well, that's a way of decoding space, is that you have a ripple, and so the ripple gives you your temporal sequence. So the encoding. I think we're not disagreeing fundamentally. You have both space and time as mechanisms for storing and retrieving information. But there isn't any necessary given that temporal information has to be stored in a way that's more temporal.
I'm completely with you on that. I only threw time away and halfway this discussion.
Yeah.
So you're not necessarily combining time with your item and context information. There's no need to do that. Right? Your time warp the whole thing. That was my point also earlier. You don't want to mentally time travel in real time. It doesn't buy you anything.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's why you also want to segregate from real time, right?
Yeah.
To manipulate it.
And that means you don't have to privilege time.
Absolutely.
Having a special storage mechanism.
But that's something else as saying the temporal dynamics of this circuit is encoding relationships between items. And
right? You have to unpack it, and that has to involve
one reason why you want to kick out time.
Yeah.
So you can exploit the temporal code. It becomes ambiguous. Right?
Yeah.
So look, Lluís. Now we dragged you along in this speculation, and we see that you still want to don't believe in the Theta Gamma code, which is good. This is a great idea. But so you're, as a psychologist, you're in this. Also, this the neurophysiology, and also if you want, the neuropathology of memory. We should work with epilepsy patients, right? So if people would like to follow in your footsteps in this complex domain, what would be Lluís' law?
Work a lot. Work a lot. Work a lot, yes. No, yeah. Work a lot, yes. And be surrounded by great people. I think this is like the element. Actually, so I did my PhD here in Barcelona, but then I moved to London. And of course, I learned this is again different ways of learning, right? And so the two of them gave me completely different stories. But so when I was in London, I had this opportunity to be surrounded by like people who were amazing, and not just because of the sort of papers.
In Barcelona, they were not so amazing.
No. It was a completely different. So in Barcelona, what I learned, because I had this sort of opportunity to do the PhD with myself. So kind of, right? And then you learn that walking is an important aspect. We know it's how science goes, right? Mm-hmm. That's one of these. So you have to dedicate a lot of time. But
you're right? I mean, the academic culture in London, fantastic.
And then I just realized...
And Sheffield, of course.
And Sheffield, I know.
UK generally.
Yeah.
UK generally. Well, so I'm
not saying London itself. I'm just saying like this sort of like a drive that gives you being surrounded by stimulating people, right? And I think actually this is like a critical aspect when I talk to, now I have my students I came back a few years ago. And I really have to express this ideas to them when they don't want to go out and do a postdoc, for instance. I say, look, it's not just, like leaving your place, is that it's an essential ingredient of science. You need to not just, like survive in another world. You have to realize that this is something real or partially real. And I would, so basically, work a lot and be
make friends.
Put yourself out there.
But the second thing is, there's something about the relationship between Tony and myself that you're not aware of yet. Tony likes traveling, right? And I have to sponsor that. So always after a podcast, 4 years later, he visits the lab of the person we interviewed.
Oh, boy.
To check whether a prediction they made during the podcast is confirmed or not. And since in this case it's just a tram ticket, we can also include your lab now.
You can come too.
I might leave the lab myself. But what's the prediction that you really would like to stick your neck out for today?
For my lab, or in general?
For your work.
For my work.
Yeah, because he's going to go to your lab to check whether you confirm it or not.
So I kind of like have this sort of feeling that the sort of like line of research and the research that I'm currently doing, which is it's going to incorporate more and more, I would say on the one hand, risky projects, because that's something that I believe that this system in Spain allows you to do it. And on the one hand, on the other hand, bring more technology, rather than, like classic neuroimaging studies. Something slightly more creative. I mean, that's why we started using like wearable systems, blah, blah, all these sort of things. We are not the only ones, of course. And something I'm not sure about, but I think that actually the system is pushing us to do it. It's something more applicable, something more into, I wouldn't say industry, maybe like for patients, but something like to fully dedicated to kind of like to solve problems. So all these sort of ideas are already in the seeds are there, because all the projects have these sort of elements now these days. But I think these three will be, that would be my wish.
Yeah, but no, that's not the prediction I was expecting.
Okay. If I'm going to be alive.
I made a different prediction on your prediction. I mean, you're going to say, I'm going to prove that all recall depends on gamma range responses,
theoretical ones.
But only above 80 hertz. That's it. Science is hypothesis driven.
Okay,
that's what it tells us all the time.
So, in 4 years, how many years?
Except 4
or 5.
If you want 2, that's fine.
So I think actually, I need to think a bit more.
So the kind of thing you print on a T-shirt, right?
Mm-hmm. So actually, so what I think is actually we will be able to explain many fundamental mechanisms, many of them would be applied to real life situations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I'm pretty sure we'll do it in 2 or 4 years, like pattern completion, pattern separation, but not just for a lab-based experiment, but something like completely naturalistic. I'm pretty sure we'll be able to do it.
Will we be able to read out and replay people's episodic memories through fMRI?
For instance.
No, my hippocampus always lies.
But now, for instance, what we can do is what of experiments we wanted to run. In a kind of, now it's already like the data that we have in collaboration with people that have already worked with fMRI, which is fantastic. But at the same time, the EEG gives you the possibility to do it in the fine-grained thing.
Right.
We can, if you watch a movie, like standard movie. I don't know if you know the papers.
Yeah, I know these. It's a bit grainy.
It works we did it with EEG,
right?
And it worked fantastically well. I truly believe in this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's amazing. I mean, you can simply like disentangle and like look for units.
What resolution?
Milliseconds.
You're gonna say like, oh no, because okay, the subject is looking at a human being, or you can say the subject is looking at a Spanish.
No. Sorry, I was not saying like that. Decoding this sort of information. No, I'm saying like when you watch a movie, I'm saying that from the signal, right? You're watching a movie, watching like our interview here, and didn't ask anything, and just by your brain signal, we can now know which sort of chunks of information are going to be forgotten in the later recall.
Okay.
Right, okay.
So you can tell me afterwards which information the movie didn't care about.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That's maybe not the kind of application I would spend money on.
but no, seriously, because no, exactly.
Advertising.
But that's one small step.
A small step for Louise, a big step for neuromarketing.
That's a real ambition for 4 years.
Great. Well, see, Tony, you better be prepared. Lluís Fuentemilla, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much for the interview. Fantastic.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.